please. I'm just a humble butcher. My son didn't take part in this. My boy is only 10 summers old. He doesn't understand the consequences of his actions. Who are you? Why are you yelling at my father?
Welcome to Expeditions Rome, a turn-based hex grid CRPG set in ancient Rome. Developed by Danish developer Logic Artist and published by THQ Nordic. Logic Artist has 3 other games under their belt, 2 of which are part of the Expeditions franchise. Conquistador in 2013 and Vikings in 2017. Since the release of Rome in January of 2022, some core members of Logic Artist have left and formed a new studio named Dynasty Studios. I'm not sure what that means for the series. With the small introduction out of the way, let's jump into the game. When starting the game, you select your difficulty settings, create your character, and choose your class. You get role-playing choices as well that unlock certain dialogue options and gives a bit more personality to your character. I enjoy the small history tidbits the difficulty settings offer, and there is a classic mode for those who may be familiar with Fire Emblems. One of the first things you'll notice when starting the game up is the visuals. Visually, the game looks great. Level of detail for the environment is over the top. All map textures are impressive, and I've found myself multiple times throughout the entirety of the game taking a few seconds just to admire it. Additionally, the world map, armor, and weapons look fantastic as well. I'm no historian, I'm unable to tell you how accurate anything is, I just know it's nice to look at. If you care about historical accuracy, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who are more than happy to show you how much they know. On the other hand, there are some visuals I don't particularly like, mainly the character models. Some of them look like clay molds. You can tell the difference by comparing the first face on the left to the other 3. There are 3 of what you see in the game. It's very apparent in some cutscenes. Mainly the ending cutscenes, where it would matter the most. I do, however, enjoy the character art that you see pretty frequently in dialogue menus, and these are well done and probably the intended look of the characters. Speaking of dialogue, the voice acting for the characters is powerful.
Power is the most intoxicating wine.
All of your main party companions are top of the line.
What are you waiting for? You have nothing to hide, do you?
Because the law threatens obliteration, everyone obeys it, and everyone expects it to be obeyed.
Even the soldiers stationed around your camp have some memorable lines.
You don't want to be remembered as the man who burnt down the Library of Alexandria.
Maybe I'll race you to it.
There's only one character throughout the entire game that felt really out of place, and
You're in the Temple of Obasti, and I am her priestess. If you're not nice to me, I will bestow you with a curse, and ornery tomcats will piss in your bed every night forever!
thankfully you don't have to deal with that for long. The sounds of combat in the game are nothing spectacular, and it's nothing to fault it for, it's just nothing really stands out to commend it.
I'll shoot as soon as I see them.
My favorite is when your party rallies and all cheer after you kill a defenseless wounded soldier on the ground. The soundtrack is exactly what you expect for a game set in this era. Only had a couple of instances where the music didn't match what was going on in game, and that only happened during a couple of random combat encounters. It wasn't really that big of an issue. Overall, it's really enjoyable and matches the era perfectly. Finally, we move on to the gameplay. This game does have, believe it or not, controller support. I played around with it for a bit, and exploring felt really nice, with the combat taking some getting used to. Main navigation in the game is on the world map, moving from area to area where you then get to select what party members you control to then further explore and or fight. As you move around on the world map, you have random encounters that pop up as time passes. These generally have some lines to read through, decisions to make, or sometimes even combat. Once you got about halfway through the game, you've seen all of them. There's several of these random encounters are always some kind of hindrance. Loss of supplies, a party member injured, a warning that one of your garrisons will be attacked soon. It really just extended the gameplay by slowing you down rather than any meaningful interaction. I wish this was done differently instead of just relying on RNG. I generally try to keep my wish list short when talking about games, but this game has quite a few, I wouldn't call them necessarily issues, but just things that could use better polish. When it comes to true exploration, I only found a few instances where I found anything actually hidden. Anything that might be out of line of sight and tucked away in a corner, you can easily just highlight it by pushing Alt. I left this on 98% of the game, and I felt like I didn't miss out on much. If you feel like there is a combat encounter coming up, there is no need to carefully place party members in the best possible position before the combat. There's always a predetermined blue hex grid square that your party members automatically move to, and then you get to select their positions from there. While having a combat position predetermined is perfectly fine, I do enjoy the option outside of combat to take control of individual party members for the possibility of unique dialogue interactions. Jumping back to combat, combat walks the thin line of being enjoyable and not too repetitive. The turn-based combat at least. We'll talk about the other form of combat here soon. This isn't some fantasy game like Divinity Original Sin 2 or Baldur's Gate 3 where you can cast fireballs, summon minions, change the environment, or drop junk-heavy barrels on enemies one-shotting them. This is a game limited by its historical setting. Now, I don't mean limited in a negative way. It has plenty of options with 4 classes to choose from, along with 3 specializations for each class. You're not locked to one specialization either, and you can combine these trees at any time you see fit. My first worry when it came to combat was the enemy variety. Finding the same 4 classes that I also have access to worried me that I'd be able to predict to a certain degree what the enemy is going to throw at me. Luckily, as the game progressed, this proved false. The game also has an interesting mechanic of untrained units, spotted by the pawn icon next to their health bar. Killing a pawn restores your action point, giving you the opportunity to attack more than once or to move farther if need be. With the right calculations, you could do some massive damage. There are plenty of crowd control effects, different weapon skills, and well-balanced loot throughout the entire game. It never felt stale, and I would argue it's almost perfectly balanced. There's a number of battles in the game where you use your entire party to besiege a city. These are massive battles on much larger maps where you get to control multiple parties with their own objectives. These are fantastic and probably my favorite part of the game. They generally offer new challenges to combat other than just eliminate all enemies. They can be long, but I think they pace these out perfectly. And by the way, do yourself a favor and speed up the enemies' turns in the options. It'll cut the combat time in half. While we're talking about combat, I did want to talk about the camera briefly. I had some frustrations with it. I don't think it's hard to control, but it felt a little bit restrictive. You can only zoom in and out so far, and the isometric angle is maybe only 30 degrees of freedom. You can't go top down, and the terrain determines the camera's height. Some buildings the camera can see or go through, while other buildings act as terrain. On maps where the terrain or structures are very varied, it feels like I'm on a roller coaster panning across a map going up and down, up and down. If there's a bridge crossing a valley, I can only view the bridge when the camera is over top of it. I cannot go to the side of the bridge and view it or my camera will drop into the valley. Camera controls can be a huge make or break for some people, and this was playable, just not ideal. I mentioned another form of combat earlier that is not so entertaining. There are open field battles you do with your legion. First glance, it's exciting. The battle starts and you command your legion with one of 3 different stratagems. Each round you select one stratagem and you select which stratagem that helps you the most or hinders you the less. Congrats, you have now experienced every single open field battle in the game with only slight variations as you progress. You cannot manually control the troops and you do not participate in the battle personally. You just sit there and select tactics and just push auto resolve till you get to the next stage until it ends. It's a interesting idea. It's just very poor execution in my opinion. I don't think it takes away from the pacing of the game. It just doesn't take a whole lot of participation from the player and it feels more like a chore than anything. The UI in the game is very simplistic and easy to use. In between quests, combat, and exploring, you frequent your legion's camp that you can upgrade by capturing resources on the map. This is where you hire new Praetorians, manage supplies, heal your party, and interact with your companions. It's a great mechanic, but a little rough in efficiency. There's a lot of loading screens in order to acquire the items for the crafting research that you do. This also includes healing party members from serious injuries, and it's just a lot of idle time, both in loading screens and on the world map. Like I said earlier, the gameplay is actually pretty good, it just needs some polishing. Some of these are nothing but nitpicky complaints. The story, on the other hand, I have very little complaint about. I'll try to simplify the beginning as best as I can. The story starts out with your father being killed by a rival political family. The accused murderer just married your sister, and your mother thinks the best course of action is to smuggle you out of Rome and send you away to join the army and go to war.
It has been some time since we had a good war.
After being smuggled out of Rome, you're ambushed by pirates.
Captain!
Yeah?
Once you arrive safely under Consul Lucullus's command, you're recruited into a special squadron of Roman soldiers. After proving yourself by running a few errands, you advance on the enemy through a narrow pass that no one will ever suspect. Much to your surprise, the enemy suspects. You then save the Legion from a disastrous ambush. The reward is an instantaneous promotion to Legatus, a similar ranking to a modern-day general.
I hereby promote you to Legatus.
You now have full command of your own legion, Legio Victrix. You're now tasked with conquering the rest of the Pontus faction and enacting revenge against your brother-in-law. I did want to discuss the ending. If you want to avoid spoilers, please skip to here. As you progress further into the game, you discover the actual villain mastermind is not your brother-in-law, but instead his brother Lurco. Beginning Act 3, a war with the Gauls was started after they raided Rome, and Lurco used this opportunity to be appointed dictator after becoming tired with the length it took the Senate to make any decisions.
I am the Senate.
As the war finishes and you acquire sufficient evidence to condemn Lurco, you head back to Rome. You are taught throughout the game that a Roman law and tradition is that legions disband before crossing the Rubicon.
We stop playing fair. Consider the Rubicon. No legatus is allowed to keep their command inside the Pomerium. The Legion shall always disband here, beyond these predefined borders. So it is written, so it shall be done.
This is where your first decision that impacts the ending occurs. You can cross the Rubicon with your legion and lay siege to Rome, surprising Lurco and truly having the upper hand for the first time, but at the cost of Roman citizens. Or you can disband your legion and accuse Lurco in the Senate, attempting a more peaceful and diplomatic approach. Let's start with the first option. Invading Rome. After finishing up a few more objectives and convincing powerful notables to join your cause, you eventually reach Lurco. You end up defeating him, and his brother, your brother-in-law, shows up and actually deals the killing blow. From there, you then get to decide the course of action with your companions. Here comes the actual endings. First, you can submit yourself to the Senate, which concludes in your execution. You'll be remembered by many, but not exactly glorified. Perhaps this is the most honorable thing to do, but it turns out shortly after, Rome continued to struggle without any real leadership. You were someone who had everything in the world just within grasp to give it all up at the very last second. Your second option is running away and living your life as an exile. Depending on previous decisions made in the story determines where exactly you go. I find this ending the middle-of-the-road option. You don't get to live as a citizen in Rome anymore, but you've conquered your objective and get to continue living life on your own terms. Take it as you will. Your last option is you can become the first emperor. You can rule over Rome and lead into a golden age. A number of companions disagree with this decision, saying you're no better than Lurco himself, and maybe they're right. To the citizens, you're perceived as a deity, and you rule with the Senate still intact, but with no legal power, mainly just for show. My main issue with this is that the game doesn't necessarily discuss what about the emperors after you. It's kind of something to keep in mind, and sure, you might have been mighty and lead the empire into a successful era, but the guy after you could have been just as bad as Lurco. Circling back to crossing the Rubicon.
Let's go celebrate that we all made it back alive. First round is on me.
If you make the decision to disband your legion and take your evidence into the Senate to accuse Lurco, you're met with, in my opinion, more personal consequences. You once again confront Lurco, this time on the Senate floor. Once the debate has somewhat concluded, Lurco realizes he's in a bad position. He then proceeds to expend all possible options to have his way. He's desperate at this point. Lurco takes to the street, holding your companions hostage and threatening that if you don't submit to his will, he will execute your friends one by one. Attacking him saves your companions and ends with one of two endings of submitting yourself for execution or exile like previously discussed. The other option to this situation is a more diplomatic approach. After finally talking him down and convincing him to surrender, you get your other endings to choose from, one of which ends with you climbing the ladder of Roman politics, eventually making your way to consul. You lead the Roman citizens to a golden age, and similar to the emperor ending, but with the Senate, Roman traditions, and Republic still intact. Another option, when it's all said and done, is that you could just simply retire. You've done your duties, served your time, it's time to go home, take care of your vineyard, and relax. Now I called this the peaceful path, but it actually ends in two of your companions dying. I believe it's the same two each time, and doesn't change depending on your actions. The ending themselves are great. I think the weakest ones are where you submit yourself to the Senate or go into exile, and maybe I'm only saying that because you get those choices on both paths. Expeditions Rome is a game I can easily recommend to anyone who enjoys hex grid, CRPGs, turn-based combat, and historical settings. While the history may not be 100% accurate, it is 100% entertaining and immersive. While the gameplay can be dragged out at times, disrupting the pacing of the story, it is enjoyable. The characters are well written, unique, and left me wanting more. The combat stays engaging throughout the entire game and feels so damn good when you start chaining kills after everything is perfectly positioned. There are some aspects I discuss I wish were done differently. It's certainly not a 100% polished game, but it is fun. If you do come across this game on sale, I recommend buying it, and it's also at the time of this video's release on PC Gamepass. And that's all I got. See you.
is the most intoxicating wine.